The silence in the garage was a presence, a heavy, familiar blanket woven from memory, and dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light. It was a silence I shared with the '67 Chevrolet Camaro, a relic of a life that once roared. For 10 years since Robert's heart had stuttered and stopped, the car had been his stand-in, a sleek, cherry-red monument to the man who had loved me, and then had loved this machine. I'd kept it pristine, a ritual as sacred as prayer. The scent of gasoline and old leather a ghost I welcomed. The phone's ring was a shriek in the quiet. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered, my hand still smelling of the polish I'd been applying. The voice on the other end was hesitant, laced with an apology I didn't yet understand. Mung? My name is Ben Carter from Carter's Classic Autos. I think I may have just made a terrible mistake. My breath hitched. He explained that a young man, charismatic and full of easy smiles, had sold him a pristine Camaro. The paperwork was signed, the money wired. But something nagged at Ben. A story about upgrading for his growing family that didn't match the reverence with which the man had described the car's restoration. A detail about the original owner, a man named Robert, who had passed. A detail I had only ever shared with family. He said his name was David. Ben said, his voice soft, grave. He said he was your son. The world tilted. The floor beneath my feet became a precipice. The polished key fob I still held in my hand, the one with the tiny, worn leather tassel Robert had added, turned to ice against my palm. David, my boy. He hadn't just sold a car. He had sold a fingerprint of his father's soul, a chapter of our story, and he had done it for a reason that would soon feel like a second, more profound death. He had sold my heart to take his wife to Paris. The phone was not an intruder, not at first. It was just a phone, ringing in the quiet of a house that had grown accustomed to silence. The sound sliced through the thick, golden haze of a late Saturday afternoon. A haze filled with the lazy dance of dust motes, stirred up from my ritual in the garage. The scent of carnauba wax and old leather still clung to my hands. A perfume of memory I wore with a quiet pride. Each swipe of the cloth across the Camaro's flawless crimson flank was not a chore, but a conversation. A way of touching a past that was both painfully distant and as immediate as the smell of high-octane fuel that lingered in the still air. This was my church, and the Camaro was its altar, a gleaming, silent testament to a love that had been built not just on promises, but on the rumble of a small block V8 and the shared dream of an open road. The phone persisted, a shrill, mechanical counterpoint to the organic stillness. I almost didn't answer, my focus still on the perfect, mirror-like finish. On the ghost of my husband's smile I could still see reflected in the paint. But habit, that relentless master of the widowed, pulled me from the garage, through the laundry room, and to the wall-mounted handset in the kitchen. The number was unfamiliar, a string of digits that meant nothing, likely another telemarketer, another voice trying to sell me something I didn't need in a life I was no longer sure how to live. I picked it up with a slight sigh, the wax on my fingers making the plastic feel slippery. Hello. The voice on the other end was not the brisk, impersonal clip of a salesman. It was a man's voice, middle-aged, tinged with an uncertainty that was immediately palpable. It was a voice that seemed to be choosing its words with the care of someone defusing a bomb. Ma'am, he began, a pause hanging in the air between us, filled with the faint static of the line. My name is Ben Carter. I'm the owner of Carter's Classic Autos over in Millbrook. Millbrook was a 40-minute drive away, a world away from my quiet suburban street. I had no reason to know a Ben Carter, no reason for a car dealership to be calling me. My mind flickered to my son, David, a mother's instinctive, fleeting worry, but just as quickly dismissed it. He was a grown man, with his own life, his own wife. He didn't need me worrying about his car troubles. Yes, I said, my tone guarded, my gaze drifting back towards the garage door, my thoughts still half with the Camaro. How can I help you? He cleared his throat, a soft, nervous sound. I believe I may have just made a terrible mistake. The words landed not with a bang, but with a slow, chilling seep, like cold water filling a room. A mistake? What mistake could this stranger have made that involved me? My first thought was one of mundane error, a wrong number, a confused identity. But the gravity in his voice, that heavy, apologetic tone, suggested something far more significant. I'm not sure I understand, I replied, my own voice tightening, the wax on my fingers suddenly feeling less like a connection to memory and more like a stain. He took a deep breath, and I could almost see him on the other end of the line, leaning on a cluttered desk in an office that smelled of coffee and paperwork, grappling with a moral dilemma. A young man came into my dealership this morning, Ben Carter continued, his words measured, deliberate. He was selling a car. A 1967 Chevrolet Camaro. Rally Sport. In absolutely pristine condition. The world did not shatter then. It simply paused. The dust motes in the kitchen light seemed to freeze in midair. The familiar hum of the refrigerator vanished from my awareness. All that existed was the voice on the phone and the slow, cold dread coiling in my stomach. My Camaro. Robert's Camaro. He described it with the keen eye of a connoisseur. The correct shade of tuxedo black for the hood stripes against the red, the specific pattern of the houndstooth interior, the numbers matching engine. He'd verified himself. He spoke of its perfection, not with the glee of a new owner, but with a growing, dawning horror. The paperwork was all in order, he explained, the words sounding like a confession. The title was clear. He had the registration. The money was wired to his account this afternoon. It was a clean, straightforward deal. He paused again, and the silence was heavier than any noise. But after he left, something didn't sit right with me. It started to eat at me. He described the seller, my son David. He described his charm, his easy smile, the confident way he'd talked about the car. But he said there was a disconnect. David had spoken of the Camaro's restoration with technical precision, listing parts and hours of labor, but his eyes, Ben said, held no love for it. There was no light in them when he ran a hand over the fender, no catch in his voice when he mentioned the original owner. And then he'd mentioned the reason for the sale. An upgrade, he'd said. Something more practical for a growing family. A trip, he'd offhandedly added, a once-in-a-lifetime trip to Paris for his wife. But it was the last thing, Ben Carter said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if he were sharing a secret too terrible to speak aloud. It was the story he told about the man who restored it. His father. He said his name was Robert. He said he'd passed away about a decade ago from a heart condition. My knees felt weak. I reached out, my wax-smeared hand gripping the cool formica of the countertop for support. Robert's name in this stranger's mouth was a violation. The intimate, brutal truth of his death, reduced to a piece of conversational detail to facilitate a sale. He said his name was David. The voice on the phone concluded, the words final and devastating. He said he was your son. And in that moment, the unthinkable discovery was complete. The phone was no longer just a phone. It was the instrument of my betrayal. The quiet of the house was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a tomb from which a precious, sacred artifact had been stolen. The scent of wax on my hands was no longer the smell of devotion. It was the smell of a trust that had been systematically, coldly, and irrevocably broken. The foundation of my world, already cracked by loss, gave way entirely, plunging me into a new and terrifying abyss of grief, not for the dead, but for the living. The drive to David's house was a blur of streaking lights and a roaring in my ears that had nothing to do with the car's engine. I didn't remember getting in my sensible sedan, backing out of the driveway, or navigating the familiar turns. My hands were clamped on the steering wheel, my knuckles white, the ghost scent of car wax now a sickening mockery. Ben Carter's voice played on a loop in my mind, a stark, damning recording. He said he was your son. Each repetition was a fresh fracture, a new hairline crack spreading through the portrait of my life. A portrait I had so carefully, so painfully, held together after Robert was torn from it. The image of David, my bright-eyed boy, standing in that sterile dealership, haggling over the price of his father's soul, was a physical nausea in my gut. I didn't park so much as abandon the car at the curb outside his neat, modern townhouse, a place he and Sarah had been so proud to buy, a symbol of their future. I saw the warm glow of the living room lamp through the window, a scene of domestic peace that felt like a lie. The walk to the front door was a mile long and over in a second. I didn't ring the bell. I used the key he'd given me for emergencies, the cold metal a bitter weight in my hand. The door swung open into the warmth of their home, and the smell of roasted chicken and herbs from their dinner still hung in the air. David was in the living room, lounging on the sofa with his laptop open, a contented, post-meal ease on his face. Sarah was clearing plates from the dining table, her laughter at some private joke dying on her lips as she saw me standing there, a storm contained in a mother's frame. "Mom," David said, his face shifting from surprise to a flicker of confusion. And then, so quickly I would have missed it if I hadn't been searching for it, a shadow of guilt. "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." The irony of his words was a sharp blade. "The Camaro," I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. It was flat, stripped of all emotion, a barren landscape. It was the calm before the cataclysm. He froze. The casual, open expression on his face shut down, replaced by a careful, guarded neutrality. He closed his laptop with a slow, deliberate click. Sarah had stopped moving, a stack of plates held tightly in her hands, her eyes wide and darting between us. "What about it?" he asked, his tone artificially light, a pathetic attempt to deflect. "It's gone, David." The silence that followed was heavier than any I had ever known in my own quiet house. It was a silence filled with the unspoken, with the crumbling of trust. He had the audacity to look relieved, as if I'd merely discovered a misplaced set of keys. He let out a short, nervous breath that was almost a laugh. "Oh, that? Yeah, I sold it. I was going to tell you." The casual betrayal in that single sentence, "I was going to tell you," unleashed the tempest I had been holding back. The flatness in my voice shattered. "You sold it." The words were a raw, wounded cry. "You sold your father's car? You walked into that garage, you saw that car that he poured his heart into, that he loved more than almost anything, and you sold it? To a stranger?" He stood up now, defensive, his posture squaring off. "It's just a car, Mom. A rusty old project that was just sitting there, gathering dust. It's not like he's coming back to drive it." The air left my lungs. Just a car. To him, it was metal and rubber and an outdated design. To me, it was the echo of Robert's laughter, the memory of his hands, grease-stained and capable, the tangible proof that a man of such vibrant life had once existed. It was the vessel of our history. "How could you?" I whispered, the pain so acute it was a physical wound. "How could you even think of it?" And then came the justification, the part that would forever alter the tectonic plates of our relationship. His face, which had been defensive, hardened into something I didn't recognize. It was a mask of cold, pragmatic entitlement. "Think of it," he retorted, his voice rising. "I thought of it because it's an asset, Mom. A useless, sentimental asset that's worth a small fortune. Look around you." He gestured wildly at their comfortable home. "We have real lives to live, a future to build. Sarah deserves something beautiful, something unforgettable." He looked at his wife, who had gone pale, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I sold it to take her to Paris. For 2 weeks. The city of light, Mom. A dream trip. Something she's always wanted. That money is going to give us memories, real memories, not just haunt a garage." He said Paris as if it were a holy word, an incantation that justified any sin. He presented it as a grand, romantic gesture, a testament to his love for his wife. But to me it was a monument to his disrespect for his father. He was funding his future with the shattered pieces of my past. He was trading his father's legacy for a hotel suite and a view of the Eiffel Tower. The confrontation became a brutal collision of two irreconcilable realities. In his, he was a pragmatic provider, seizing an opportunity to bless his marriage. In mine, he was a grave robber, desecrating a shrine for a vacation. My grief was a raw, screaming thing. His was a forgotten relic. My voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the sheer force of a heart breaking anew. That car was the last piece of him I had left that still felt alive. It was his dream. He rebuilt it for you, David. He always said it would be yours one day. For a fleeting second, I saw a crack in his armor, a flicker of the boy who had once looked at his father with hero worship in his eyes. But it was gone, replaced by a stubborn, selfish resolve. "Well, it was mine," he said, his voice cold and final. "You gave it to me. And I made a decision for my family. It's done. The money's in the bank. The papers are signed." He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw not a son, but a stranger who had calculated the monetary value of my happiness and found it lacking. "You need to move on, Mom. It's been 10 years. It's time." And in that moment, standing in the warm light of his home, surrounded by the evidence of his life moving forward, I understood the true depth of the betrayal. It wasn't just about the car. It was about the deliberate, calculated erasure of a memory he no longer found useful. It was about his willingness to break my heart for a trip to Paris, and to stand there and call it progress. The phone felt like a dead weight in my hand after I placed it back in its cradle. The click of the receiver, a period at the end of David's devastating sentence. The silence in my kitchen was no longer peaceful, it was accusatory. It pressed in on me, amplifying the phantom roar of an engine that was now gone. The ghost of a presence that had been violently exorcised. Ben Carter's words, his hesitant, apologetic tone, had been a map to a crime scene, and David's cold justification had been the confession. But it was an intellectual understanding, of facts and figures kind of horror. I knew the car was gone. I knew it had been sold. But I didn't feel it, not in the marrow deep way that would make it real. The knowledge was a storm cloud on the horizon, threatening but not yet breaking. I stood there for a long time, my hand still resting on the cold plastic of the phone, my gaze fixed on the doorway to the garage. That threshold, which I had crossed thousands of times with a sense of reverence, of connection, now felt like the entrance to a tomb. I was afraid to look, afraid of the void I would find there. But a force stronger than fear, a desperate, grieving need for confirmation, pulled me forward. My feet moved slowly, each step an effort, as if I were wading through deep water. The cool, dim air of the garage hit my face, carrying its familiar scent. A blend of concrete dust, old motor oil, and the faint, sweet smell of the polish I used. It was a smell that had always been a comfort, the smell of Robert, the smell of home. But now, it was the smell of an absence so profound it had a physical weight. My eyes adjusted to the gloom, and there it was. Or rather, there it wasn't. The space where the Camaro had lived for over a decade was a gaping wound in the center of the room. It was a vast, empty expanse of oil-stained concrete, a stark, light-colored rectangle outlined by a darker patina of dust, a perfect silhouette of what was missing. It was a negative space that screamed. I walked into the center of that emptiness, my shoes making a hollow, lonely sound on the floor. I stood where the driver's side door would have been, where I had stood just hours before, running my cloth over the sleek red metal, talking to Robert in the quiet of my mind. Now there was only air. My eyes traced the outline on the floor, an archaeologist of my own ruin. There was the faint drip mark from where the radiator had once wept a single, glistening tear. There was the scuff on the floor from the time Robert had, in a fit of exuberance, spun the rear tires on a damp day, leaving a brief, black signature of joy. These were the fossils of our life together, and they were all that remained. I knelt down, my knees pressing against the cold concrete, and I placed my hand flat in the center of that empty space. I could almost feel the vibration, the memory of the engine's idle thrumming up through the floor, through my bones. I closed my eyes and I could see him there, his head under the hood, his shoulders flexing as he tightened a bolt, humming some old rock song off-key. I could see my younger self, sitting on a stool, handing him tools, listening to him explain the intricacies of the four-barrel carburetor with a passion that was as much a part of him as his heartbeat. This wasn't just a parking spot. It was a stage where the most cherished scenes of my life had been performed. And now the main actor was gone. And the set had been struck, sold off for scrap by the very person who had once had a supporting role. A single, hot tear escaped, tracing a path through the fine layer of dust on the floor. Then another. I didn't sob, the pain was too deep for that. It was a silent, steady leak from a soul that had been punctured. I saw the phantom car so clearly I could almost touch it. The way the light from the single bare bulb overhead would catch the curve of the fender, the deep liquid shine of the crimson paint that Robert had applied himself in a makeshift spray booth, his hands steady, his eyes squinting in concentration. I could see the worn spot on the driver's side bolster, the leather softened and creased by years of his presence. I could smell the unique, proprietary blend of gasoline, vinyl, and his Old Spice cologne that had permanently infused the interior. This visceral encounter with the emptiness was a more brutal confrontation than any words with David could ever be. His betrayal was an abstract concept until this moment, standing in the cathedral of its consequence. He hadn't just sold a vehicle, he had sold the setting for 1,000 memories. He had sold the echo of his father's laughter that seemed to still bounce off these walls. He had sold the tangible proof of a love that had been built, piece by piece, bolt by bolt, in this very room. The trip to Paris he had so casually mentioned. The hotels, the meals, the flights. It all felt obscene, a gaudy, transient pleasure purchased with a piece of permanent, sacred history. This emptiness was a language David would never understand. It spoke of legacy, of love that outlasts a heartbeat, of a presence that lingers in the spaces we leave behind. His world was one of transactions and upgrades, of moving forward at any cost. My world, our world, Robert's world, was here, in this dust-covered garage, in the ghost of a machine that was more than metal, in the profound and screaming silence left behind. I stayed there on my knees for a long time, my hand pressed to the cold floor, communing with the absence. And as I knelt there, the initial paralyzing grief began to curdle into something else, something harder and more determined. The hollow space where the Camaro had been was no longer just a monument to my loss. It was a challenge. It was a void that demanded to be filled, not with a new car, but with justice. The quiet resolve that had been seeded during Ben Carter's call, and watered by David's coldness, now took root in the fertile ground of this profound emptiness. This was not over. It could not be over. To let this stand was to agree that Robert's memory, our love, was as disposable as an old appliance. As I finally pushed myself to my feet, my body aching, my eyes dry now, I looked at that empty space one last time. I made a promise, not to the ghost in the garage, but to the man who had built his dream there. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The emptiness of the garage was a cold, hard fact that followed me back into the house. A shroud I could not remove. The confrontation with David had left me raw. The image of his defiant, uncomprehending face seared onto the back of my eyelids. The trip to Paris. He had said it with such finality, as if the sheer romanticism of the destination sanctified the theft. I moved through the rooms of my home like a ghost, the familiar objects, the sofa we'd chosen together, the bookshelf he'd built, the photograph from our anniversary, now seeming like artifacts from a civilization that had been wiped out by a cataclysm. The money was in the bank, he'd said. The papers were signed. The finality of it was a stone in my gut. I found myself standing before the large, fireproof lockbox we kept on the top shelf of the bedroom closet, a relic from a time when we had important documents to protect. My hands trembled as I brought it down, the weight of it feeling symbolic. Robert had been the organized one, the planner. I fumbled with the combination, our anniversary, and the lock clicked open. Inside, nestled beneath old passports and birth certificates, was a slim legal-sized folder containing the paperwork for the Camaro. My breath hitched as I pulled it out. There was the original, yellowed bill of sale from the previous owner, a man in Arizona who'd called the car a rust bucket with potential. There were the receipts, meticulously kept, for every part, every can of paint, every single item that had transformed that potential into perfection. And then there was the title. I unfolded it, the paper crisp. Robert's name was there, clear as day, in the field for the owner. And in the field for the lien holder, it was blank. He had owned it outright. But then my eyes, blurred with tears, caught sight of a different document paper-clipped to the back of the title. It was a single sheet, a letter, not notarized but written in Robert's unmistakable, looping handwriting. The heading simply read, "For David." My heart hammered against my ribs. I remembered this now. Robert had written it in those last fading weeks, when his strength was sapped but his mind was sharp, when he was trying to put his affairs in order for a future he wouldn't see. He'd called it his car guy instructions. I'd thought it was just sentimental ramblings, maintenance schedules, perhaps. I smoothed the paper on the bed, my vision clearing as I read his words. Words I hadn't been able to bring myself to read since the day he died. David, if you're reading this, then you're probably old enough, and I'm probably gone. The Camaro is yours. I always dreamed of handing you the keys. But a car like this isn't just a thing you own. It's a responsibility. It's a piece of history, and more than that, it's a piece of our family's history. I built it with my 2 hands, dreaming of you in the passenger seat. This car is my love for you and your mother, made tangible. It's not an asset. It's not a pile of money waiting to be cashed in. It's a legacy. So, son, my one condition, my only rule, is this. You must promise me, you must promise your mother, that you will never, ever sell it. If you don't want it, if your life takes you in another direction, then you give it back to her. It belongs with her, as surely as my heart does. This isn't a legal document. It's a father's last request. Honor it. The air left my lungs in a rush. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the paper shaking in my hands. It wasn't a legal loophole. It was something far more powerful. It was a moral covenant. A dying man's wish, articulated with a clarity that cut through a decade of grief and landed with the force of a gavel in the present. David had not just betrayed me. He had desecrated his father's final heartfelt plea. He had treated this sacred charge as a mere suggestion, one that was inconvenient to the planning of a European vacation. A fire I had not felt in years ignited in my chest. It was no longer just about my loss. It was about Robert's voice being silenced, his love being commodified. Ben Carter's words echoed back to me. Something didn't sit right with me. He was a man who understood cars, but more importantly, he seemed to be a man who understood the souls that were poured into them. He had sensed the disconnect. He had felt the wrongness of the transaction in his bones. With a resolve that felt both terrifying and righteous, I picked up the phone. My fingers, now steady, dialed the number for Carter's Classic Autos. When Ben answered, his voice was still heavy with the burden of his earlier call. "Ben," I said, my voice clear and strong, no longer the trembling widow he had first spoken to. "It's Margaret Evans. We need to talk. I'm coming to see you. And I'm bringing something you need to see." The drive to Millbrook was different this time. I was not a victim being pulled by the currents of betrayal. I was a woman on a mission, armed with the truth. The folder sat on the passenger seat beside me, Robert's letter a palpable presence. Ben was waiting for me, standing in the doorway of his office. His showroom was a temple to automotive history, filled with gleaming, restored dreams. He looked at me with an expression of profound pity and deep respect. Without a word, I handed him the folder. I watched his face as he first glanced at the title, confirming Robert's sole ownership. Then I pointed to the letter. "Read this," I said softly. He took the single sheet of paper, his eyes moving slowly across Robert's handwriting. I saw his jaw tighten. His shoulders, which had been slumped in discomfort, squared. He finished reading and was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the words as if absorbing their weight. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were bright with a fierce, unshed tear. "A father's last request," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He looked from the letter to me, and then out towards his lot, where I knew the Camaro now sat, a captive. "He didn't have the right," Ben said, the words definitive. "The title may have been clear, but the spirit of the ownership wasn't. He lied to me. He lied about the heart of it." He took a deep, resolute breath. "A deal made under false pretenses, under a fundamental breach of good faith, is no deal at all. I'm in the business of preserving history, Mrs. Evans, not erasing it." He walked over to his desk, picked up a file containing David's bill of sale, and the wire transfer receipt. "The money will be wired back to his account today. The car is yours. It was always yours." The legal and emotional reckoning was complete. It wasn't fought in a courtroom with lawyers and legal jargon. It was won in the heart of a decent man who understood that some things, love, legacy, a father's last wish, transcended paperwork and bank transfers. Justice was not an abstract concept in that moment. It was the weight of a set of keys being placed back into my open, waiting palm. The return of the Camaro was not a victory parade. It was a somber, silent procession led by a flatbed truck that carried a gleaming, crimson casket containing the ghost of my former life. Ben Carter himself drove behind it in his own truck, a silent guardian ensuring the precious cargo arrived home. When the truck carefully backed into my driveway, the groaning of its hydraulics as it tilted its bed felt like the world itself was sighing in exhausted relief. The driver, a young man with careful hands, unstrapped the car and guided it down the ramps with a reverence that my own son had lacked. The wheels, once destined to eat up the open road with Robert at the helm, now rolled the final few feet back into the darkness of the garage. The sound of its engine, which Ben had started for me at the dealership just to hear its healthy, rumbling purr, was now silent. It was home. But it was a return to a kingdom that had been irrevocably altered. Ben helped me push it the last inch into its sacred space, the space that had screamed of its absence just days before. He handed me the keys, his hand lingering for a moment in a gesture of solidarity. "It's where it belongs," he said, his voice low and sure. I simply nodded, unable to form words around the boulder of emotion in my throat. He left me then with a final, respectful nod, closing the garage door behind him, and leaving me alone in the semi-darkness with the car and the crushing weight of its return. The restoration of the legacy was a physical fact. The car was back. The empty space was filled. The tangible proof of Robert's love and passion was once again under my roof, safe from the avarice and short-sightedness that had threatened to erase it. I ran a hand over the cool, flawless paint of the driver's side door, my fingers tracing the same path they had for a decade. But the ritual felt different now. The connection was no longer a pure, untroubled line to the past. It was now a line that had been severed and hastily spliced back together. The scar of the betrayal forever a part of its history. The car was no longer just Robert's car. It was the car David had sold. It was the car that had been ransom for a Parisian holiday. Its shine seemed to hold a new, sadder knowledge, a gloss over a deep and lasting crack. Later the phone rang. It was David. His voice was not the defiant, cold tone from our confrontation, nor was it the contrite, apologetic one I think some small, broken part of me still hoped for. It was stunned, bewildered, and burning with a sense of his own victimhood. "The money," he stammered, "it's gone." The dealership reversed the wire. "What did you do? What did you say to them?" I could hear Sarah in the background, her voice a sharp, upset murmur. The dream of Paris was evaporating, and their shock was a toxic cloud. "I showed him the truth, David," I said, my voice eerily calm, the storm within me having passed and left a vast, flat plain of certainty in its wake. "I showed him your father's letter. The one you ignored." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a silence I did not fill. Let him sit in it. Let him drown in the quiet implications of his own actions. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, but still laced with that infuriating sense of injustice. "You had no right to interfere. It was my decision. You turned that man against me. You've ruined everything for us." And in that moment, any last, fragile hope that he would understand, that he would fall to his knees in remorse, shattered into dust. He was not sorry for what he had done. He was sorry he had been caught. He was sorry his transaction had been voided. The chasm between us was not just a matter of disagreement. It was a fundamental difference in the architecture of our souls. He saw a commodity. I saw a covenant. He saw a vacation. I saw a legacy. There was no bridge that could span that divide. "Goodbye, David," I said, the words final and heavy as stone. The click of the phone was the sound of a door closing, not in anger, but in a profound and sorrowful acceptance. The relationship was altered, perhaps forever. The victory of the car's return was inextricably woven with the loss of my son. The phone did not ring again. The silence that returned to the house was of a different quality than before. It was not the peaceful silence of memory, nor the screaming silence of absence. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the war has ended. There were no victors, only survivors tending to their wounds. I walked back into the garage. The Camaro sat in its rightful place, a monument to a love that death could not conquer, but that life, with all its cruel complexities, had deeply wounded. Its presence was a restoration, a reclamation of a sacred promise I had made to Robert to protect the things he loved. But as I stood there, the scent of wax and gasoline filling my lungs, I understood that the legacy was no longer just the car. The legacy was now also this moment. It was the strength to choose the love of the man who was gone over the convenience of the man who remained. It was the painful, necessary act of holding a line in the sand, of declaring that some things, memory, promise, a father's last wish, are not for sale at any price. The car was home, but my family was broken. I placed the keys on the workbench, next to a photograph of Robert, young and smiling, his hand resting proudly on the Camaro's fender on the day he first got it running. The legacy was secure. It was beautiful, and it was whole, and it would never again leave this garage. And it was the most bittersweet victory I would ever know. Help me reach 7,000 subscribers. Please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments.